Hello, this is Jeffrey Tucker, the president of the Brownstone Institute, and I'm very pleased to be here with Adam Creighton of the Australian. And I think we're meeting each other for the first time,
Yes, I
right?
think that's right.
That's a little strange. We've never bumped into each other before.
Well, we've certainly exchanged messages on Twitter, and I'm a big fan of you, Jeffrey. So you've been
Wow.
writing some amazing stuff since this pandemic broke.
Yeah, let's talk about the pandemic breaking. Now, just today, I'm sure you've seen the news, Shanghai, completely locked down. Stay-home orders, factories shut, businesses closed. All to drive cases once again out and to zero. And so here we go again, right? I mean, you've been covering that sort of region, I guess that would include Oceania, which includes China and New Zealand and Australia. And there does seem to be a kind of a drive for zero COVID in that area of the world, and I don't know if it's how much and to what extent it's been influenced by China. But well, let me ask you: are you surprised that China's still doing this 2 years later?
No, look, I'm probably not. I mean, firstly, it is very concerning, and it's worth pointing out how little coverage this latest lockdown has got in the US press, I think. And I mean, the Will Smith slap is obviously far higher up the list of priorities than 26 million people losing their human rights for potentially weeks or months. Yet again, this is the second or third or maybe even fourth lockdown now that China's imposed on a very populated region of the country since January 2020. It's extraordinary. I mean, am I surprised that they're doing it again? No, because of the innate pride of governments, and especially a government like China's, which would not want to be proven wrong, so to speak. And so it's going to persist with this. I mean, the great risk for them, and I'm sure they realise it, is that they can't keep doing this, right, for years. It's very disruptive, not just to China, but to the rest of the world as well, in terms of supply chains. So, no, I'm not surprised, but just saddened that they haven't seen an off-ramp somewhere in the preceding 2 years where they could claim victory and not have to do it again. I mean, they should have just said, all right, the latest variant is weaker, so we don't need to do this anymore. But strangely, they haven't said that. That seems to be what Western governments like Australia and New Zealand have done at least. They've at least used the new variants as an opportunity to off-ramp from the crazy lockdowns, and they probably won't be doing it again. I mean, it's interesting you said earlier about the extent to which governments in that region have been influenced by China. And look, I'd like to think no, but you'd have to also think that given the extraordinary network amongst universities, Chinese funding, kind of going to Australian universities, New Zealand universities, and others around the world, that there is some sort of subconscious link. And I actually think back to 2020 when the New Zealand Health Department put up a document which it promptly took down after Michael Sanger drew attention to it, that praised China's health response, basically. And so I think amongst pro-lockdown people who are honest, and there's maybe not many of those, but they'd have to admit that the intellectual foundation of these lockdowns does come from China.
Well, and the World Health Organization in the early days had praised. I just watched this video the other day with some fellow from the World Health Organization praising China to the skies for having crushed the virus. And in February, there was a delegation sent from the NIH, the U.S., to 2020 to go to China to learn from them on how to control.
Yes, well, I mean, this is a great embarrassment, this latest lockdown, I think, for the intellectual lockdown movement, if you like, because the whole argument was, as I recall, that you only have to do this once and then you kind of stop it in its tracks. And I think everyone now knows that's completely ridiculous. So I don't know what the latest argument kind of is. I don't think there is one, hence the lack of coverage of China's lockdown. On the World Health Organization, I'm kind of surprised by, I mean, obviously it's a big organization with many directors and many different points of view, and sometimes they say sensible things. Most of the time they don't, but I mean, it's worth going back to their documents from 2019, which were very sensible. And I think, I mean, as you know, there was I think October 2019, they published a big a pandemic plan, which was for influenza, but I mean it could equally have applied to any other contagious disease, where they essentially ruled out all of these options. And even towards the end of 2020, there was a fellow, maybe a British director of the WHO, David perhaps, I can't think of his name now, but he said that lockdowns were not the policy of WHO and that they shouldn't be used. And then other times you hear the opposite. So I think that organisation's probably very torn internally. They have a lot of intelligent people who've worked in this field for a long time. And I think a lot of people deep down know that lockdowns were the wrong thing to do in hindsight, and indeed probably at the time as well. But there was just so much hysteria and sense of urgency that you just had to try anything, no matter how damaging, which was a huge error.
You cover Australian politics, or at least you did, right? You I think you've since moved to the U.S.
That's right.
But in the early days, you were trapped in another land of zero COVID.
Yes.
Were you in Melbourne? Or
No,
Sydney?
so I lived in Sydney, and I was the economics editor of The Australian before I came here. I came here 1 year ago, actually, next week. So I've been in Washington a year, covering the US now, which is, of course, a huge area. But yeah, so I was the economics editor, and then before that I was economics correspondent. So I pretty much covered economics for the 10 years I've been at The Australian, which was a good foundation, I think, to analyse lockdowns. And I was very saddened, as I've written repeatedly, how few economists came out against them. That was especially true in Australia, where even our supposedly top economists wrote public letters to support lockdowns and to support government measures. And that was very, very depressing for me, because it just goes against so much of the teaching of economics on so many levels. And I can only assume the people who wrote those letters were just trying to garner likes and retweets and support from governments, perhaps in the hope of getting future grants or favours or jobs in some way, because they couldn't honestly, deep down, think that was the right thing to do.
Well, you have a problem that all these experts have their field of expertise, and sometimes they when something happens that doesn't involve their field of expertise, and they're asked to comment on it, but they just figure, well, I'll defer to the other experts. So in the case of economists, I mean, I don't know any economists who know anything about infectious diseases. I mean, now for sure, any intellectual should have just gone to Amazon and downloaded Cell Biology for Dummies and spent a couple hours reading about it. That would have spared us 2 years of hell. But
Yes.
But you had your economists that were, I guess in some sense scared that they didn't know anything about this pathogen.
Yes.
So they decided, I guess, that my knowledge doesn't work. And then you had your epidemiologists and public health officials who clearly didn't know anything about economics and didn't think there was any big deal in shutting down
Yes, I know.
commerce.
I mean, economists should have known better, because the foundation of the whole discipline is about choice and individuals, and that's the individual utility is the basis of the entire discipline, and choice is sacrosanct in many ways. And so if you're going to prevent people making the most basic choices, not just for a week, not just for a month, but for months and months on end in the case of Australia, it is just extraordinary that you'd think that was an optimal thing to do. In fact, under any circumstances. I mean, it is just so extraordinary. So I think it's been a shameful period for the discipline. And personally, I can't speak to some of these people ever again, because I just think that they have, put their own personal self-interest in a very limited sense far ahead of far more important principles for society. And sure, they got a few cheap likes and retweets on Twitter from the usual set. That's great, but they contributed to this problem by encouraging governments. And actually, I'm a little bit. I mean, I think governments in private, the politicians I talk to, often agree with the views that you've put forward, that I've put forward, but they felt compelled to act in this way by the extraordinary hysteria that was generated by the press, by the mainstream press largely, and that includes me. I mean, I wasn't part of the hysteria, but I'm certainly part of the industry that caused it. That's a really deep question of how, when there's another pandemic, how we're going to react next time. I mean, I'd never be against shutting the press down, but we have to realise that when something like this happens, there's going to be instantaneous hysteria, and you have to try to counter it.
It's funny because I was going back and, I've just been obsessed with this topic as you have for 2 years, but I went back and read the New York Times coverage of the 1968-69 pandemic.
Interesting.
And the 1957-1958 pandemic, and the 1942, 43, and 45 polio pandemic, and then the 1929 parrot flu scare.
Yeah.
And they always said the same thing. They said bad pathogens out there. Be careful. If you get sick, get in touch with your doctor. Otherwise, trust your public health officials and stay calm. Don't get hysterical. Pathogens are part of life, and we'll get through this.
Yes, it's remarkable cultural change.
Yeah, it was just like 2 or 3 paragraphs. That's what they always did.
Yes. Well, my understanding was Eisenhower in the 50. I think he was president in 58. He refused to even talk about it. And was not going to do anything about it. It was just a keep calm and carry on attitude, I guess, that carried over from the Second World War.
Yeah, right. And Obama was very similar in 2009. Now, one of the things that's a little puzzling, I don't know if you were there. Do you remember SARS-CoV-1 at all?
Not really, and that's because it got kind of vaguely I remember it, but it was more of an academic proposition than anything practical. I don't think there was any response to it in Australia from memory.
Well, it's something to look into, and there's so much to research here. But there's some sense that people thought that the WHO had something to do with containing that, because it never became a global pandemic. It was quite a deadly strain.
Yeah, well, it was much more deadly, I understand, but a lot less contagious.
That's inevitable, right? I mean,
yes.
There's always a trade-off.
Yes, that's right. That's right. So no, in terms of past pandemics, the cultural change is extraordinary. And the other thing that I've been struck by too is the basic innumeracy of commentators. They keep saying the figures about deaths from COVID-19, and I think it's 6 million or something now globally, from or with, but that's the official figure. And of course, that's a big figure, but the world's population is much, much larger than it was in the 50s and 60s. And so you have to, make that, you have to compare like with like. And I don't think the latest pandemic is greatly worse than the 58 or 68 one.
Right.
I mean, it's certainly not an order of magnitude, nowhere near that.
Yeah, I think that's right. And then also you have to do the age adjustments.
Well,
because,
that's a very good point. And of course, everyone was much younger back then. So, it's not a surprise when you're in a nation like the US or Australia or Europe, where there's lots of old people and lots of very unhealthy people, especially in the US, that you would get a lot of extra deaths from even a relatively mild new pathogen. What is interesting about this virus is it doesn't seem to be going away. And so I wonder if this is just the norm now. There's, 3 million deaths a year from this that replace flu deaths and other deaths.
Yeah. There does seem to be a certain crowding out, like we say in economics.
Yes.
The new pathogen crowds out the old pathogen. It's like
it's extraordinary how the flu just vanished since March 2020 in every country, as far as I know.
So we're headed towards endemicity, if we're not already there, at least in most places of the world now. Do you recall your first filing on the subject of COVID and lockdowns from Sydney?
I certainly do, because it was received, with very vehemently by a lot of people. It was the 17th of April, I think, 2020, when I wrote a column. I've been stewing on it for a couple of weeks, and at first I was very worried about the whole pandemic. Actually, in March, I remember calling senior people, just worried I was going to lose my job, that the world was going to end, and of course it didn't. And then I started looking at the facts and figures for a few weeks as they were rolling in, and it became clear to me that we were overreacting. I mean, even if you extrapolated what was going on, it was just not severe enough to warrant this extraordinary hysteria. And so I wrote a column where the heading was we are overreacting to an unremarkable virus, which at the time it was published was kind of peak hysteria, if you like. And the column went viral and got a lot of comments, and it certainly lifted my profile. And not that that was the intention, but it did. And then I kind of kept writing in that vein for the rest of the year in Australia. I think I became pretty much the chief proponent, so the chief critic, if you like, of what we were doing in Australia, pretty much for the first few months, and then a few other people kind of came on board too. But certainly me, it was just me at first in terms of mainstream press.
Well, Gigi Foster was.
Yeah, she's fantastic. She's a fantastic woman, and she's done so much. Some really good analytical work she's done, like a true economist should have done, and she's written a fantastic book on it with some other Australian economists.
Which I should add, Brownstone published.
Yes, indeed. No, it's a fantastic book. So she's fantastic, but honestly, there was just 3 or 4 of us. That's it, and there's a lot more now, but success has many fathers, so to speak. Not that it was success. That's not quite the right phrase, but you know what I mean.
Sure.
And I think there are very few proponents of lockdowns left now in Australia. There was a zero COVID crowd, which were very influential early on, and that was a view pushed by a Melbourne think tank called the Creighton Institute, which I have a lot of respect for. They've done a lot of terrific work, but I was very upset that they took that view on COVID, and in hindsight, it just looks complete madness. And I must say I do enjoy tweeting their zero COVID paper a few times since. I think I did it recently because it just looks so silly now. But the other problem is none of these people that propose these things face any accountability for their actions. They all stay in their jobs and their lovely houses and their enhanced share portfolio thanks to all the quantitative easing and so forth. Indeed, most of the Zoom class have had a wonderful pandemic, and indeed, from a purely personal point of view, you can see why they'd want it to continue. They have less travel, less face-to-face interaction with colleagues. They get to keep the same salary. Their house price goes through the roof. Their share price goes through the roof. Less travel costs, less dry cleaning costs. I mean, it never ends. It's fantastic for them. And frankly, all those things apply to me as well. I mean, all of those benefits apply to me, but I still don't think that's a reason why I should argue for lockdowns. I think they've been a complete disaster. And as a journalist, it's my job to try to argue for people that don't have a voice in the media, which is largely the people who were never affected.
In Australia, I'm not sure when the lockdown actually happened. Maybe it happened in April. I'm not sure, but there were many people that were saying, "Well, hey, this is actually a great thing because for all the usual sort of protectionist reasons,
Yep.
It keeps production in Australia, and whereas people used to take their I forget now what they call them in Australia, but their vacations, their
Holidays.
Yep. You take them in wherever, Morocco or some fancy place like Shanghai or something like that. Now you had to scarf around various.
Well, that's an interesting point because Australia was one of the very few countries where Australians spent more overseas than foreigners spent in Australia, and so if you imposed a wall around the country, if you like, you suddenly got this huge influx of money being spent in the country. So it was a protectionist racket for the local tourism industry, actually.
Yeah, that's right. So suddenly the outback is the new Morocco or whatever.
Yes, that's right. So the impact of that was kind of disproportionately spread. Obviously, because foreigners tended to holiday in Sydney and Melbourne in the glitzy hotels, whereas Australians tended to go into the outback and the regions. So the money moved around, but in net terms, it was a positive for the tourism industry in Australia.
Yeah, but now you've got now there's a problem, right? So now, after 2 years with no tourists coming in, and also, by the way, for a good part of the time, it was quite severe, right? I mean, if you flew into Australia, you had to quarantine for 2 weeks at your own expense in an appointed hotel, at $200-$300 a night or something like that.
Yeah, pretty well. It was $3,000 for the was it 3,000 or 1,000? It was in the thousands, and that was for a week, I think. I'm forgetting the actual figures now, but yes, it was a long time, and you had to pay for it. And gosh, it's extraordinary thinking back on it now, because what stupidity really, given that then the virus spread massively anyway. So I don't know what the point of all that was.
It did, and you saw it all coming. I mean, it was a little spooky, right? I mean, to watch this bragging politicians.
Oh yeah.
In Australia, I think it was. I don't know if it was one of the regional premiers, but I mean, forget the crazy guy in Melbourne. But,
Dan Andrews. Yeah.
Yeah, that guy's utterly insane. But even Liberal Party people were saying things like, "Oh, Australia's the envy of the world. We alone have crushed."
Yes. No, the first half of 2021 was basically all that constantly, because there was that outbreak in Melbourne in the second half of 2020, which provoked a very severe response from the government there, from Dan Andrews, multiple lockdowns, very severe lockdowns. And they said that they had defeated it. We'll never know to what extent that actually helped, but they said they defeated it, and then there wasn't really another outbreak until the second half of 2021, and then there were multiple outbreaks all around the country, and it was clearly out of control. The multiple lockdowns in Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, all the big cities, and it's pretty clear they didn't really do much in the end, because then everyone gave up kind of by the end of last year, and now they're just living with COVID, so to speak. But there's still a lot of restrictions. I mean, as far as I know, you still got to wear a mask inside in Melbourne.
Oh, it's true in Western Australia too, is it?
Yeah. Oh, yes. Western Australia. I didn't even mention this. It's just kind of so crazy out there by itself. But I think they've lifted I think you can fly to Perth now without an issue. I think, but I mean, it was closed off for at least a year from the rest of the country.
Yeah, for the whole rest of the country, and then but then you have the track and trace nonsense.
Oh
right?
yes, that was amazing. I mean, so I came here in March 2021, but I did experience a few months of that infrastructure, if you like, in Sydney, where every time you went to a bar or a restaurant, you had to check in with your phone or write your name down and your mobile number. And this was all given to the government just in case there was an outbreak. And then if there was, they would let you know via text message. I mean, the computational challenges of that are just so extreme. It makes you wonder why they thought it was feasible and sensible in the first place. And then, of course, also the second round effects, incentive effects of what that's going to do to people's behaviour. They're not going to go out. They're going to stay home. They're not going to check in. They're going to lie. I did laugh a bit earlier. Late last year, they still had these mechanisms in place, and if you were sent a text, then you had to stay home for 2 weeks. This was around Christmas time, and of course there wasn't formally a lockdown. And a lot of the pro-lockdown people were saying, well, see, it's just as bad as a lockdown. No one's shopping, no one's going out. It's terrible for the economy. But of course, it was because of rules. It was because of this track and trace system that if you got a message, then you couldn't, then you had to stay home for 2 weeks. And so everyone was worried about Christmas Day. They wanted to see their family on Christmas Day. And so you had this period for about 2 or 3 weeks before Christmas where no one was going outside their house, even though there was nothing that stopped them from doing that. In theory, but of course you have this track and trace thing, which was just effectively a lockdown, if you like.
I see. So it was the fear that if you went out, you would get exposed, and then you couldn't see your family.
Yes. So I think by that point, no one really cared much about the virus. It was really, they cared about seeing their friends and family at Christmas. That's what they cared about, and so they avoided going anywhere where they might catch the virus. So that was another example of kind of bureaucratic stupidity.
And then you had, I think, to get abused. I've spent a lot of time in Australia, so I've followed it. Also, it's just a weird experiment in zero COVID, which is just bizarre. Which, I think from the very beginning I knew they were just kicking the can down the road at best, right? And you felt the same way. So it's a little creepy to see everything just unfold the way it did. But there was these. I mean, every country has its stories, but there was this moment where the police were scanning Instagram and Facebook for pictures, for selfies.
Yes, it's extraordinary. I mean, famously, you would have seen the Victorian woman who was arrested in her house for posting a message on a pro-freedom Facebook site saying that she was against lockdowns and so forth. And under some obscure part of some public health act, that was technically illegal. And yeah, she was arrested in her own home. That was extremely shocking. But that was just the first of the shocks, really, the first of the awful incidents. I mean, the police brutality and overkill was just unbelievable. I mean, 2020 there weren't too many protests, but by 2021 there were many protests in Sydney and Melbourne, very big protests, lots of violence. Tear gas was used. I mean, just extraordinary images that you'd never expect in Australia. And I kept thinking to myself, what if the virus was a bit more deadly or a bit more contagious, for the next one? What, does the army just shoot people? Do the police just literally mow people down in the street with machine guns? I mean, I'm not being too hysterical. That's surely the next, cranking it up to the next step. Surely that's the logical conclusion of this attitude to public health management. I mean, it's just bonkers.
And then you had the rhetorical apparatus from the top, the rhetorical machinery from was guy Morrison, the
the Prime Minister was. I mean, I think Scott Morrison was sympathetic to the views of people like us, but I mean,
but you wouldn't know it. I mean,
no, you wouldn't.
For a while there, I think you're probably right, but for a while there, you would get these things that the protesters are being selfish.
Oh, of course, that was the rhetoric. That was the rhetoric. That was the rhetoric in the media too. The bulk of the media were very against the protesters, that they were being selfish. And I think it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, that the hysteria that had been whipped up had made people very scared of the virus. Indeed, I mean, just the other night, I was talking to my parents back just south of Sydney, and they're still scared of the virus, and it infuriates me because they're double vaccinated, perfectly healthy people. And they're still scared of it, and I blame the media for this. I mean, for scaring people kind of unduly, and I mean, it's a real testament to the power of the mainstream media. People often say, "Oh, the media is declining. Newspapers are declining. They're not as powerful anymore." The whole pandemic's made me think. Well, actually, they're probably more powerful than they've ever been. Yeah. Okay, they're financially weaker. Yes, that's true, but in terms of their power, they've never had so much power. Because people are reading their headlines 24 hours a day, kind of in a way that they were never doing in the 50s and 60s. There were very, very discrete times where you'd consume news, maybe at 6 o'clock at night, maybe reading the broadsheet in the morning or the tabloid in the morning.
40 minutes.
Yeah.
30 minutes. And, and 10 of that was taken up with weather and sports.
But now, literally, as soon as you get up in the morning until you go to sleep, you're consuming news and headlines. And I think we've seen the impact that has. And it's pretty scary.
And so you make a good point, because the thing about looking at a person on a screen telling you what's what, it's much more tactile and compelling than looking at, for example, charts and graphs on health department websites that are looking at the demographics of hospitalization and death. And if we had done that, people would have just calmed down, and there never would have been anything.
Yes, I know.
Apart from elderly, infirm people maybe protecting themselves for,
the denominators, if you like, were never shown. It was always just the numerators were all that was in the story.
That's right.
So you never had any sense of context or how many people die normally. I mean, people are dying all the time. I mean, 60 million a year. I mean, I think 160,000 a year in Australia. For all sorts of reasons, and each of those deaths is sad and tragic in its own way, but they don't attract any kind of media attention by and large. But now you have this small sample of deaths, and it is a small sample in the big scheme of things. It is small, and there's just an obsession with them, just total obsession. And I mean, you can't blame the media too much. I mean, it's following its financial incentives like all businesses do, and these stories get a lot of attention. They get a lot of clicks. So what was sadder for me more was that there weren't more opinion columnists like me who were trying to argue against the hysteria. I mean, the news pages are going to do those things. They're going to do their thing like news pages have always done, like tabloids have always done, right? That's just expected. That's a given. But there were far too many intelligent people, in my view, who were not pushing back against it.
How many columns do you estimate that you've written generally on this topic over the last 2 years?
Well, I have one formal column a week. So I've probably, I'm sure I'll be written almost 100 on this issue, yeah. Yeah, it'd be almost 100, probably about 80 or something like that. But
did you have any war stories? Like, did you ever get calls from public health people, or is it?
Oh, look, I mean, I got a lot of pushback to the extent that I had to change my name on Facebook. I had a few death threats on Facebook kind of early 2020. To the point where my parents were worried about my safety, actually. I mean, I was never worried about my safety, but yeah, there are some crazy people out there, and I guess you don't know what they're going to do. So I did change my name on Facebook just to stop getting the awful messages from people that I didn't want to receive. And apart from that, I think my newspaper, The Australian, was actually really good to me. They encouraged my kind of contrarian view, I suppose you'd say, and it got a lot of attention. It was well read, and the paper published views on both sides. I mean, mainly on the other side. I think I was fairly unusual in my view, but I can't complain. I have no complaints about my employer. There was a column I wrote late last year when I had COVID myself here in Washington, and it was, I had a pretty bad case of it. I guess I was pretty sick for, 3 or 4 days, and I had lingering symptoms maybe for 10. And I wrote a column about it, and I just kind of said, look, it's a virus, but it's no big deal. I got better, and then I kind of rattled off the statistics of of how it's basically fine for most people. And someone complained about that column, formally complained through formal channels that I was being flippant or not taking the virus seriously enough. And yeah, that complaint's still going through the works.
Oh, good heavens. Right. Well, I mean, I could tell you amazing stories about my situation too. By the way, I had COVID also, and I found it to be like far worse than I ever expected. Now, no hospitalization or whatever, but that thing was, for me, just a beast. Now, on the other hand, I'd never get sick. I haven't been sick in 30 years,
Yeah. No, I kind of had similar. I mean, I still remember when I got it because, it was something. I got it in New York on the 15th of November at a party. Lots of us got it that night. And then I came back, didn't have symptoms for about 3 or 4 days. And then the group of us who went to this party all got symptoms roughly around the same time. So we tested ourselves. And for the first day or two, I thought, it's nothing much. But then for 2 or 3 days, I was really ill. I mean, again, I didn't go to the doctor or anything, but, I had really bad fever. I was extremely tired. I sweated a lot. And towards the end of it, I actually, I was getting a bit worried because I wasn't getting better. Normally I get better really quickly. I mean, I'm a fairly healthy person. And I'm normally over a viral infection in, maximum 3 days, maximum. Sure. But this was 7 or 8 days and I was still not better. And then about the 26th of November, 27th, suddenly I just was gone. Yeah.
Eventually.
Yeah. So it does annoy me when people say that I'm a COVID denier or whatever. I mean, I'm clearly not. I've had it and it's bad. But that's got nothing to do with the sense of measures to combat it.
Right. No, and here's the other thing that I've noticed, because I know everybody's had COVID and everybody has a different story, but there's no way to tell how you're going to react to it. I mean, your immune system's either programmed to combat this kind of virus or it's not, and my mind clearly was not. I didn't expect it, but so I hated it, but there wasn't anything that the control measures could do for me once you got sick, which is, I think, the essential point that public health in the old days made, which is that disease is an individual thing,
Yes.
and you get the virus, you need to get better, and which raises a weird topic. I mean, just this sort of absence of serious focus on the therapeutics is one of the more bizarre.
That has been very strange. I mean, I haven't written much about the whole vaccine drama and the therapeutic dramas. I mean, because I thought, I'd kind of bitten off quite enough as it was with lockdowns and everything else. I mean, I've touched on those issues, but they're more technical and they get more scientific, and they're not my areas of expertise, so I kind of keep away from them. But certainly I have thought it's strange that the extraordinary pushback against, whether it's ivermectin or hydroxychloroquine or whatever the others are. To me, it's an issue between a doctor and a patient as to whatever they, how they want to treat a virus. And it's got not much to do with the government, frankly, or newspaper columnists or kind of other people. And yet, for some reason, on these two drugs, it's just such almost a religious fervor about banning them or stopping them. And I don't understand it. And in fact, if you look at lots of famous people like Donald Trump or the Brazilian president, or indeed Clive Palmer, who is one of Australia's richest men, who got COVID last week and was not vaccinated and took ivermectin because his doctor recommended that, and he's better again. If you look at these very rich people, they quite often take these drugs. So that's got to make you wonder, doesn't it? They're obviously making sure they get the best health advice.
Well, so it's not your area, but is ivermectin distributed in Australia? I guess
my understanding is that, well, certainly hydroxychloroquine is banned. The government actually banned it, which to me is just so bizarre. As far as I know, these drugs have been around for a long time. They're kind of harmless. It's not a poison, and to ban them is just crazy. But I'm pretty sure that doctors will get a massive fine if they prescribe them. I'm talking $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 fine. Don't quote me on that, but there are definitely strictures against using them, which I find very odd, and kind of all part of this whole odd kind of 2 years of governance, very strange governance, where if you had said these things would happen 3 years ago, I think people would have thought that you were mad.
Yeah. Now, what about the censorship? I guess most of the digital tools that Americans use are the same ones that Australians use, for the most part, I think.
Yes. It's the same. The censorship's worrying me more and more. As you would know, more and more people get removed from Twitter, or their talks are taken down from YouTube. Seems to be happening more and more all the time. And I think it's a real worry. I think that our system of government, or our system of governance as a society, is becoming more like China's, slowly, very slowly. But that's the direction we're going in, where you have big tech and government helping each other to ensure that there's a narrative, and that the people don't go too far outside that narrative. And if they do, they're kind of disappeared online, if you like.
Yeah, it's enormously frightening. Now, as an economics columnist, you're also on the beat of covering things like inflation and budget stuff. Well, let's just talk about inflation and the possibility of food shortages, the housing boom, and so on. All these things are connected in a way to lockdown policies. U.S. lockdown March 16th, 12th, 16th, 2020, and then Congress spent a couple of $1 trillion, subsidizing the lockdowns, or else they probably would have stopped right away. And then the Federal Reserve got in the business of buying up all the debt that Congress is creating, and then over 2 years, as measured by M2, you've got something like a 42% increase in quantitative easing, which is now showing itself up in prices. But it's a challenge, isn't it? For an economist, for an economics journalist to trace all these effects, not to mention supply chain breakages themselves.
It is very challenging. The interesting thing to say there, I think, is that the lockdowns as a source of inflation now, 2 years later, are rarely discussed in the press. But I think you're right. I think the origin is certainly those lockdowns, not the lockdowns directly themselves, but obviously they led to these stimulus packages that governments were compelled, if you like, to introduce, hugely expensive, massively expensive, especially in the US and Australia. If you look at the increase in debt across Western countries as a percentage of GDP, the US and Australia are at the very top, which I think is kind of interesting. More than Spain, more than France, more than Britain, certainly more than Sweden and Switzerland and countries like that, vastly more. So those countries have increased their debt hugely, and it is. And when we say debt, as you suggest, it's all financed by the central bank. There's kind of very little real borrowing going on, if you like. It's kind of financed by money creation. So you've had a huge increase in the money supplies of these countries, especially the US. And there's a massive lag effect. We know that, 12 to 18 months. And so now, lo and behold, you've got 7.9% inflation in the US.
At the very least. I mean, it all depends on how you look at it. But
and to Biden's defense, I mean, he's obviously, I'm not necessarily a huge fan, and I'd criticize a lot of things he's done, but I mean, he inherited a lot of this. To be honest, I mean, it was going to happen. Whoever won the presidency.
Yeah, and he's catching the blame, but actually, lockdowns happened under a certain other president.
That's right, exactly. And the funny thing about that is the rest of the world thinks that the US did nothing on COVID, which is complete nonsense. I mean, there are extraordinary interventions here. I mean, not in all states, but in most states, and you had an unemployment rate that went from 4 to 17% in a month. Tens of millions of people out of work. So I think there was certainly some intervention there, you'd have to say.
Right, and 3 to 4 million of those never came back to work.
Yes, that's right. They still haven't come back. They
disappeared, which is the only, I guess you would call it, bright spot of American economic life today, is that we've got a shortage of labor, meaning that anybody who wants a job can get one.
Yes.
So, yeah, please.
Yes, no, the consequences are so massive of lockdowns. They're going to last years and years and years.
Yeah. Well, good. Well, and the Australians still very happy to run you, and you're happily
yes, I think so. I hope so.
Okay.
So I cover the US obviously now, and so today, for instance, I wrote about Biden's budget, which has just been released, and I'll do a comment about that a bit later. I do TV from here too. I do Sky News from here as well about the US. So I'm very busy. I'm doing lots.
I hope you will write about this inflation issue and its relationship to lockdown. So I get a little tired. Sometimes I feel, well, I guess you feel the same way. You're sort of lonely.
Well, look, no, it's a good suggestion, and I'll make a promise in the next few weeks to do that. I'll do a column on that.
It's been really wonderful talking to you, and we'll be in touch soon.
Thanks, Jeffrey.